Welcome to this powerful and eye-opening story. What you're about to hear is an experience that reveals the unseen battles that take place within hospitals. Battles of the soul, fought in the shadows, between forces of light and darkness. It's a story that could change the way you look at illness, faith, and the very places we trust with our lives. Stay with us, and be ready to discover something that could not only save your soul, but also protect those you love. Let's begin. I have encountered something that opened my eyes to the sinister side of illness and death in hospitals. Things occur that few can perceive, but they can determine the fate of a soul. Evil conceals itself where you least expect it, and if you're not cautious, it can reach you too. I thank God for granting me the chance to share this truth, and I urge you to stay until the end, because what you will uncover could save both your soul and the souls of those you cherish. My name is Louise. I was born and raised in a Catholic family, surrounded from childhood in faith and prayer. I never questioned God, nor the necessity of living in accordance with His will. I believed that this was enough to walk in the light, but two experiences made me realize that reality is much broader than we can imagine. Two visions engraved my destiny, reshaping every belief and pulling me into a war that few witness, but which is fought daily in every corner. I was 15 when it first occurred. I was in my bed with steady breathing and my mind still awake when suddenly my room disappeared. I found myself in a hospital, a place bathed in a cold, almost otherworldly light. The corridor appeared endless, the walls desolate, and the air carried a silence that reeked of death. I looked around, and then I saw them, the patients. Bodies broken by illness, faces etched with suffering. But what immobilized me was the total lack of hope in their eyes. No one was praying, no one was calling on God, only fear, only a quiet and desperate waiting for something unavoidable. I tried to speak, but the words stuck in my throat. I felt a heaviness in my chest, a dull ache that did not belong to me, but to all of them. And then I awoke, with my heart pounding in my chest, my breath short, and sweat on my forehead. That night changed something within me. I understood that my place was there, among those who fought between life and death. I had to become a doctor. I had to bring hope to those places so devoid of God. Years passed, and I pursued my calling with commitment. Yet the second vision awaited me, prepared to shake every certainty I held. I had been studying medicine for a few years when it happened. I found myself once again in an unfamiliar place, but this time I was not a bystander. I was the doctor. I wore the white coat, my hands performing a surgical procedure. I felt the steady pulse of the monitor, the laborious breath of the patient lying on the operating table. Everything seemed normal until I looked up and saw them. Shadows. Not shadows of men, not something that belonged to this realm. They moved silently, dark and formless, like spirits without shape. They were everywhere, watching, waiting. I was frozen. I tried to speak, to scream, but my voice was muffled, as if something were attempting to stop me from acting. And then the light. A warm, sudden light that shattered the darkness and made those presences disappear. In that moment, I realized that medicine was not solely a matter of science, that scalpel and medicines were insufficient to heal. There was something deeper, an unseen struggle fought daily right before our eyes. For years, these visions stayed within me, guiding me and shaping my profession, and yet I knew they were not finished. And I was correct. A few months ago, the final revelation hit me like a thunderclap. This time, I was not in a single hospital. I was everywhere. Every corridor, every room, every operating theater was connected by an invisible thread. And there, among the patients' beds, among the machines, among the hands of the doctors, they were present. Dark entities moving in the shadows, whispering words that no one could hear, waiting for the perfect moment to seize the soul of the weakest, of those who had lost their belief, of those who no longer had the strength to resist. In that instant, I realized hospitals were not merely places of treatment. They were battlegrounds, battles unseen, fought between forces that most people never suspected existed. When I awoke, my body was shaking. I knew it wasn't just a dream. It was a warning. Something was waiting for me, and this time I could no longer overlook it. I continued to be a careful doctor, respectful of science, but I knew that wasn't enough. There was a deeper struggle, an unseen war that was not fought with scalpel and medicines. Just over a month later, during a night shift, I entered the intensive care unit, a department I knew well, where patients hovered between life and death. But that night, something felt different. I sensed an inexplicable weight on my chest. The air seemed heavier. The monitors emitted their regular rhythm. The dim lights illuminated the beds, but I had the unmistakable feeling that we were not alone. While checking a chart, I looked up and saw her, a dark figure, still, next to a bed. My blood froze. She was neither a doctor nor a nurse. I squinted, but in an instant, the figure vanished. A trick of the light? Fatigue? Yet the feeling of oppression lingered. I moved closer to the bed. The patient, a 60-year-old man, had been in a coma for weeks. His vital signs were stable, but his face was drawn, as if he were fighting an invisible battle. I leaned in. I noticed that his eyes, closed for days, were moving quickly beneath his eyelids, as if tormented by something from which he couldn't escape. A shiver ran through me. My vision returned. The presences in the hospitals, the shadows beside the beds of the sick. Science spoke of dreams, of residual brain activity. But what if that man was not simply suspended between life and death? What if he were trapped in something much darker? I spoke of it to no one. I knew my colleagues would have thought of me as a visionary, perhaps a fanatic. But inside, the truth was clear. For years, I had believed my duty was to cure, to alleviate suffering. Now I knew that my struggle had only just begun. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the dark figure, the patient's troubled eyes in his coma, the inexplicable weight on my chest, everything tormented me. But it wasn't time to stop. On one side, medicine, with its rationality. On the other, something deeper, an unseen war that I could no longer disregard. A few days later, an event changed my life. It was 2 a.m. when I was urgently called to pediatrics. A 1-year and 9-month-old girl had been brought in critical condition after falling into a pool, drowning, asphyxiation. The paramedics had resuscitated her, but her heart was weak, her body hanging between life and death. I rushed to the emergency room. On the stretcher, the little one was pale, her breathing barely perceptible. The medical team did everything: oxygen, medications, constant monitoring. Yet she worsened, minute by minute. It was as if something was holding her back. I tried to focus on the science, but then a nurse whispered, "Doctor, look at the little girl." I looked up, and my blood ran cold. The little girl still had her eyes closed, her body motionless, but her face had changed. An expression of pure terror had appeared across her features. Her mouth was slightly open, as if she were trying to scream. A shiver ran through me. This was not typical. No patient in such a state reacted this way. I moved closer, thinking perhaps it was a reflex, an involuntary movement. But deep inside, I knew the truth. Suddenly, the monitors began beeping. The girl's heartbeat faltered. The nurses prepared for resuscitation, but I couldn't take my eyes off her. She wasn't just dying. She was fighting. The machines continued beeping in an anguish crescendo as her parameters plummeted relentlessly. The nurses moved in a frenzy of swift actions, administering adrenaline, increasing oxygen, performing chest compressions. Yet nothing seemed to work. I felt sweat trickling down my back, my breath growing labored, not only from the tension of the situation, but from something deeper. An unseen oppression constricting my chest and making the room's air thick, almost suffocating. Then I saw her, a distinct formless shadow, still next to the girl's bed. A dark presence that no one else seemed to notice, as if it had always been there, waiting. My heart raced, and for a moment, I felt paralyzed. Torn between the terror of what I was witnessing and the rationality that demanded I focus on the science and the actions that might save that fragile life. Yet I knew it was not merely a medical emergency, not just a cardiac arrest. There was something else, something that did not belong to the visible world, a force that seemed determined to keep that little girl trapped between life and death. As the nurses continued their desperate work, I began to pray inwardly, silently, without uttering a word, and without diverting my hands from what needed to be done. In silence, with my heart pounding, I called upon the name of Jesus, asking for his presence, his intervention, his light in that room suffocating with shadow. Every beat of my heart became a plea, every breath a call to his authority. And the more I prayed, the more I felt something shift, as if an invisible weight were beginning to lift. Then it happened. The monitor, which moments earlier had been tracing an almost flat line, suddenly recorded a beat, then another and another, weak, irregular, but present. The nurses paused for a moment, incredulous, then resumed their work with renewed hope. While inside me, a certainty took hold, unshakable and absolute. It hadn't been just a coincidence, nor was it only the work of medicine. Something had tried to take that little girl away, but it had failed. The room appeared brighter, the pressure lifted, the shadow disappeared. But I knew it wouldn't be the last time. I knew the conflict was far from over. I exited the room with a heavy heart, unable to shake the sensation that the presence hadn't truly departed. As I walked down the hallway lit by harsh, artificial light, I tried to rationalize, to convince myself that it was merely exhaustion, that my mind was creating non-existent connections. But deep inside, I knew the truth. It wasn't finished. The following day, while reviewing some medical records in my office, a call from the nursing station startled me. The young girl was improving quickly, her readings clearly improving, her breathing more consistent. Yet something was troubling the nurses. When I asked for an explanation, the voice on the other end hesitated before responding. "It's the grandmother," she said. "She's been here since early this morning." A seemingly harmless phrase, but the nurse's tone alerted me. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my composure. After a brief silence, the reply came in a lower, uncertain tone. "She showed up without warning. She insisted on being alone with the child. When we entered, we found her with a yellow handkerchief over the child, murmuring something under her breath." A shiver crawled down my spine. "Where is she now?" I asked. "She's still there with the girl. We don't know if we should step in." I quickly got to my feet, my pulse quickening as I left my office with purposeful steps. Every part of me urged me to reach that room as quickly as possible. When I arrived at the pediatric ward and opened the door, my gaze instantly landed on the woman. She was leaning over the bed, her hand tightly gripping the frail wrist of her granddaughter. Her attire was plain, yet there was something disquieting about her. Her expression was tense, her eyes fixed on the little girl's still body, as if she saw something others couldn't. I moved carefully, analyzing the scene. The young girl, who just a few hours earlier seemed to be recovering, now appeared pale again, her breath barely noticeable. It was as if she were slipping back into the invisible battle I had witnessed the night before. The woman raised her eyes and met mine. Instantly, I felt an overwhelming unease, an inexplicable chill that swept through my body. Her gaze was unnervingly intense, as if she were analyzing me. After a long pause, her low, almost whispering voice broke the silence. "Doctor, don't worry. I'm just protecting my granddaughter." Those words should have comforted me, but the tone in which they were spoken had the opposite effect. I lowered my gaze and saw the yellow handkerchief still held tightly in her hand, a faded fabric that seemed imbued with something indescribable. I took a deep breath, attempting to maintain control. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but right now the girl only requires medical care. We should let her rest." The woman locked eyes with me for a long moment, then stood up with a slow, almost unnatural movement, as if she were unaffected by my presence. Her gaze stayed on me as she carefully folded the handkerchief and placed it into her bag. Then, with a barely noticeable smile, she spoke words that made my blood run cold. "You see, don't you?" I stood frozen, my heart seemingly stopping for a moment. She didn't say anything further. Without breaking eye contact, she turned and left the room, leaving me alone beside the little girl, still enveloped in an unsettling tension. I knew that this woman was not there purely out of love for her granddaughter. She knew something, and above all, she knew about me. I remained at the little girl's bedside, my breathing still uneven after the encounter with her grandmother. Those words, "You see, don't you?" continued to reverberate in my mind, heavy with a meaning that still eluded me. I looked at the small body lying in the bed. It was stable, but its face lacked the calmness of one who was recovering. Its clenched fists seemed to hold a hidden tension, as if even in rest it remained alert. Then I noticed the mark on her wrist, exactly where the woman had held it. The skin looked reddened, slightly darkened in the center, almost as though it were a faint burn. I lightly touched that odd mark, feeling that the skin was warmer than the surrounding area. I grabbed a piece of damp cotton and attempted to cleanse it, but the mark stayed, as if etched beneath the skin rather than resting on its surface. The little girl stirred, a slight, almost imperceptible movement, yet enough to make me hold my breath. Her lips tightened, and her body gave a small spasm, as if she were enduring a pain that didn't belong to the body, but to the soul. I scanned the room for a nurse, someone to confirm what I was seeing. But the room was empty. I was alone with her, and with the weight of what I felt building inside me. Running a hand through my hair, I tried to reason, to think logically. There's always an explanation. Yet, the more I observed that mark, the more I felt that medicine alone couldn't explain what was happening. I turned toward the door, wondering if the grandmother had truly left, or if she was still hiding in the shadows, leaving something unfinished. I looked again at the small mark on the little girl's wrist. It wasn't just a bruise, it was a brand, and I knew that the battle was far from over. For the first time in my career, I was certain that the true enemy was not a disease. It was something much darker. I returned to the girl, noticing that the mark on her wrist was fading, but her face remained tense, as if the conflict wasn't yet finished. Shortly after, a nurse informed me that the grandmother had returned, trying to enter the room. I immediately made my way to the head nurse's office, where I found her waiting for me. Her gaze was calm, yet it carried something ominous. "You don't understand, doctor. I must see her," she said. I kept my composure and explained that the little girl was improving and that the grandmother needed to leave. But her voice deepened, her tone became more unsettling. "Evil doesn't disappear just because you wish it away." A shiver ran down my spine, yet I tried to stay rational. "I trust in medicine, not in your superstitions." She smiled a cold smile. If that were true, then why do the shadows keep following her? Those words struck me more profoundly than I wanted to admit, but I remained resolute. I told her that she would no longer be allowed in the hospital. The head nurse confirmed that if she persisted, we would call security. The woman didn't argue. She turned and slowly walked away, unhurriedly, as if she knew that her departure wouldn't change anything. I returned to the room. The little girl was resting, her breathing finally even. Perhaps this battle had been won. Yet, I knew it wasn't the end. The child's breathing was steady, the unnatural pallor had vanished, yet deep within I sensed it was far from over. It wasn't long before I received a call in the middle of the night. On the other end of the line was a voice broken by despair, the mother of a childhood friend. Her daughter had been admitted in a coma, and the doctors had lost all hope. "Please come, she's dying." My first instinct was to refuse. What could I do that medicine hadn't already attempted? But I felt something inside me, an inexplicable urge, a certainty that was not my own. I had to go. When I arrived at the hospital, the air was heavy, laden with an unnatural silence. I was led to the room. Clara, my friend, lay motionless on the bed, her breathing faint, the machines recording a life hanging by a thread. Her skin was pale, her eyes closed as if sealed by an invisible force. It wasn't just a coma. Something held her captive. Then a voice within me spoke. "Position yourself to the right of her head and do not move." Without hesitation, I obeyed. I felt a wave of chills run through my skin. A silent warning. There was something in that room. It was then that I noticed the nurse. At first, she appeared to be an ordinary presence, busy arranging instruments by the bed. But then I observed her more closely. Her movements were too slow, too fluid, as if she were following an invisible rhythm. Her hands moved with precise gestures, as if drawing symbols in the air that only she could see. Her face was devoid of emotion, her eyes fixed on Clara. I realized she was not there to heal. Something in my spirit warned me with force. She was performing a ritual. Clara's heartbeat on the monitor began to slow. No, I thought. I knew what was happening. This was a battle for her soul. I felt fear trying to immobilize me, but at that very moment, the door opened, and a woman entered. She was a believer, one who understood what was happening. She looked at me and nodded. She knew. Without wasting a second, we began to sing. We declared the victory of Christ. The name of Jesus filled the room, shattering the suffocating silence. The nurse stiffened, her previously impassive face contorted into a sneer, then into a grimace of anger. She took a step back, then another. The monitor registered a slight increase in Clara's vital signs. The battle was underway. The woman continued to sing with strength, while I proclaimed life for my friend. The atmosphere in the room changed. The air grew lighter, and gradually the tension that had oppressed me began to fade. The nurse recoiled, as if struck by something. Then, without uttering a word, she spun around and left the room at a brisk pace, disappearing into the dark corridor. No sooner had she gone than Clara's eyes flew open. For a moment she lay still, her breathing uncertain. Then I saw her blink, look around in confusion. She was back. Her mother broke down in tears. I took a step back, my heart still pounding in my chest, aware of a truth I could no longer ignore. I had seen darkness up close. I had felt its presence. This experience taught me that evil does not always manifest in obvious forms. Sometimes it hides behind familiar faces, behind those who are meant to provide care and comfort. Even a nurse, a figure of help and healing, can become a conduit for something dark if she opens herself to forces that do not belong to the light. We cannot assume that everyone who works in hospitals has only the patient's best interests at heart. Some, knowingly or unknowingly, may become instruments of a power that operates in the shadows, influencing the mind, the body, and even the soul of the most vulnerable. For this reason, it is crucial to remain vigilant, to pray, to discern, and not to underestimate that the spiritual battle can take place anywhere, even in the places where we least expect it. Over the years, I have experienced many similar events, and I have learned that these dark presences manifest more intensely around those at the brink of death. They do not always come from strangers, from nurses, or ambiguous figures. Very often, they are generated by the very family members surrounding the patient. Fatigue, despair, resentment can transform into open doors for something dark. I have seen relatives who, even without realizing it, projected negative energy onto the patient, as if their exasperation and desire to end the suffering materialized into real forces, into shadows that fed on that emotion. And I have learned to see them. I have learned to recognize them in fleeting glances, in words spoken with too much resignation, in silences laden with an invisible weight. I have seen patients deteriorate, not solely because of their condition, but due to the burden imposed upon them by those around them, almost pushing them to give up. I have seen people wither, not only because of the disease, but because someone close to them was slowly extinguishing their spirit without even realizing it. And I have learned to drive them away. You cannot simply tell a son, a spouse, a sibling, you are the problem. But you can protect the patient. You can break that toxic bond without the other person even realizing it, helping the weak to find the light again without hurting someone who, in the end, is just lost in their own despair. I have lived through difficult, heartbreaking situations, battles fought invisibly in the silent wards of hospitals, in rooms where the boundary between life and death is so thin that something always tries to cross it. I have seen the presence of evil disguised as resignation, as worry, as sickly affection, and I have seen that few notice it. That is why I now leave you with this urgent message. Never underestimate the weight of your emotions, your words, your thoughts when you are near someone who is suffering. Pain, fatigue, and fear can transform into something much larger than you, becoming open doors for forces you do not understand. Evil does not always manifest in an obvious way. It does not need extreme gestures or dark rituals to insinuate itself into people's lives. Sometimes it is subtle, hiding in the shadows of resignation, feeding on the sighs of those who no longer see hope, growing in the indifference of those who are simply waiting for the end. Be vigilant. If you are with someone who is ill, fragile, teetering on the edge between life and death, pay attention to what you bring into their room, into their days, into their final moments. Do not unload your frustration on them. Do not let your exhaustion become a weight that pushes them further down. Do not allow your pain to become the shadow that envelops them. What you think, what you feel, what you secretly desire in your heart has power. If you leave room within yourself for resignation, if you accept the thought that that person is already lost, then you are ceding ground. And if there is something waiting in the darkness, it will not hesitate to claim it. Be the light, even in suffering, even when the weight seems unbearable. Choose to be a reflection of hope, of true love, of peace. For evil cannot take root where there is light. It cannot remain where there are those who choose to fight with faith, with strength, with truth. If we do not recognize it in time, evil can take much more than we imagine. It can steal a soul, extinguish a life before its time. It trap the suffering in something far deeper than illness. But if we know how to see it, if we know how to resist it, if we choose not to give it space, then we can stop it. And this battle, which many ignore, is more real than you might believe. If you've made it this far and believe this story must be heard, let us know by commenting below and share this story with as many people as possible. Family, friends, anyone who needs to know the truth. Do it for them before it's too late.